Previous lesson, we discussed how imperialism relates to globalization. Today, we're going to discuss some of the impacts on various cultures around the world due to imperialism. As the Industrial Revolution encouraged more and more companies to be established, the competition to find resources and markets grew among European countries. Many people around the world paid the price for this competition. In Africa, imperialism was driven by those ideas of gold, God, and glory. Britain, France, along with many other major European powers, all competed to gain the most territory in the continent to get the glory, and having more land than someone else could make you more money. Of course, converting the native people to Christianity was also important. What we call the Scramble for Africa really reached a peak in the late 1800s, with several wars between European countries over territory, like the fight by the British to create the Cape to Cairo corridor, a railway. After King Leopold of Belgium claimed a part of the Congo as his own personal territory and resorted to such barbaric practices as chopping the hands off slaves who didn't work hard enough, the nation-states of Europe decided to hold a conference to decide how to divide up Africa, without inviting the indigenous leaders, of course. They met in Berlin in 1884, and by 1885 they created a map with all new boundaries in Africa. However, there was no consideration for the needs of the indigenous people, with some tribes being divided by political boundaries and other warring tribes being forced to live together. This is because Europeans at this time were very paternalistic. This means they treated other cultures and races as inferior, like they were the children that needed the help of Europeans to be better. Also known as being Eurocentric, or a term you're familiar with, ethnocentric, believing that your ethnicity or race is superior. The worst demonstration of this is slavery. We talked previously about the Columbian Exchange, which included things like food, but it also included the spread of disease from the sailors and the slave trade. In the transatlantic slave triangle, British merchants would send slaves to the New World, pick up goods like sugar and cotton, which the slaves would be working to produce, and then bring those goods back to Britain. British goods would then be sold or traded in Africa in exchange for more slaves. It's estimated that up to 12 million people were sold into slavery. And while slavery has existed throughout human history, the treatment of the slaves being sold to the Americas was much more ruthless. The sad fact is that when the United States gained its independence and began to grow its economy, it needed those slaves. When the 13 colonies unified, there was disagreement over slavery, and so one compromise was to legally count a black person as only 3/5 of a person when determining representation, which in turn also impacted court cases, as the testimony of only one black person couldn't be counted as valid. After the U.S. Civil War, slaves were emancipated, and many former slaves became important politicians. But that freaked out the powerful white men who didn't want to lose their power to a black man, so they created laws that would discriminate and discourage black people from participating in politics. While these laws are now illegal, even today, race relations in the U.S. are impacted by this imperialist interaction. The impact of Eurocentrism on the cultures of local peoples was significant. The attitude was that European culture must be significantly better than all other cultures because they were currently the most powerful region in the world, forgetting that at one point the Arab world and before that the Chinese or the Romans had been powerful people and empires fall. There's a famous poem written by Rudyard Kipling that sums up these ideas. I'm just going to read the first stanza. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen people, half devil, half child. Many people interpreted this poem as the reason why white people needed to come and civilize, in their mind, the local indigenous populations. In most countries that were being colonized, Christian missionaries came in to convince the local people that their belief system was pagan and that they're going to go to hell unless they converted to Christianity. There was no consideration for the value of the local belief system or spirituality. For example, Christian missionaries introduced European values to Hawaii, and within 2 generations, the descendants of those missionaries ended up taking over the islands and claiming them for the U.S. Today, there's a cultural revitalization of the native Hawaiian culture, but many native Hawaiians feel that a cultural genocide has harmed their culture permanently. In India, the British government paternalistically felt that they were improving the lives of the Indian people by bringing them better education and medicine, but really, they were destroying the political and social traditions that had been around for centuries. The British forced the Indian leaders to adopt a more English style of government and yet treated any Indian people as inferior, even when they did everything the British wanted them to do. For example, the Indian soldiers who worked for the British East India Company were known as sepoys. The guns used by these soldiers had a powder packet that was sealed with animal fat and had to be torn open with your teeth. But the fat could be from a cow, which was sacred to Hindus, or a pig, which was forbidden to eat by Muslims. The sepoys began to rebel against their British rulers because they could see the British had no respect for their culture or traditions. Sadly, this rebellion gave the British the excuse they needed to bring British soldiers in to crush the rebellion and then further crush the rights of the Indian people. And while the infrastructure and social programs did improve the lives of many people on the subcontinent, it also meant that the British always had the advantage. Often farmers were encouraged to grow cash crops that they couldn't use to feed their own families. And local artisans or artists couldn't compete with the goods being produced in British factories. Even unintended consequences, like improved healthcare, led to population explosions, which could in turn result in some devastating famines because there weren't enough resources. And even though many Indian children in the higher castes or classes gained a solid education, they often couldn't have a good job because those were reserved for the British colonizers. Eventually, Indian leaders such as Gandhi stood up to this mistreatment. So you can see there's many different aspects and perspectives on imperialism. The Europeans were often motivated by humanitarian desires to improve the lives of the people around them, and did often improve the standard of living in areas they colonized through improved infrastructure and social programs. But the Eurocentric attitudes also meant that cultures were destroyed, and people weren't treated as equal just because of race or religion.